What is free will? Welcome to Philosopher's Corner. I'm John. What is free will? So once you get enough philosophy going around in your head and you have enough experience, it kind of leads up to a big question, and that is, do I have free will? And that really is asking the question of, do I have autonomy? Am I the one in control of my life? Am I the one making the decisions? Is my will, which is my intention for the course of events in my life that I'm choosing, happening? I mean, I did not will that bee to almost fly in my mouth, but it almost did. So philosophically, even if I thought I had free will, does the bee almost flying in my mouth, does that invalidate the sense that I had of free will? You can see this opens up a whole interesting line of thought. So people have been grappling with this for a very long time. Obviously, so many questions pop up when it comes to free will. You know, the first of which is, okay, what's the standard to say that something has free will? Is it that there's a high correlation between my internal decision-making process and the outcomes in the external reality? And that there has to be a consistent track record of my inner life and my internal decisions being reflected in the external reality to a high corollary degree for a long enough period of time that I'm satisfied with to say, to then look at my life and say, yes, I have free will? Is that the standard? Because that definitely seems to be the standard that a lot of people put on the idea of free will. That it's simply things are turning out the way I decided them to, the way I've intended them to. My will has been served. And that seems to be the only measure for a lot of people. And if it's not that, then people say, well, if it's not my will determining the course of events, then things must be predetermined. Things must be fate, right? And I believe as Carl Jung said, fate is what happens when unconscious things are happening in a person's life. They call it fate. And as we talked about before, between conscious and unconscious, that's just a matter of things that have come to your awareness. And so if we're going through life and we're an unaware being, or we have mainly unconscious things that are occurring, things that are there for us to be able to observe, but we're not paying attention to them until they become the active part of our life. And we're just calling that fate. And then we're saying, well, that's not free will. Then we don't have free will. But here's the thing. The way I analyze it, I say, you have to activate free will. So the real question is, like, even before the standards of like trying to measure the free will, we have to say, well, what are the preceding conditions? What are the necessary conditions to be in the context of it? Like the earlier question is, does free will need to be activated? In my opinion, it does. In my opinion, when you study your life or a person or whoever, every person is born and they have a certain level of awareness. And then as they progress through life, they can either consciously focus to decide to raise their awareness, which chiefly is the process of using an awareness to make certain things conscious in the life, to bring the unconscious into the conscious based on values and ranking systems and order of operation of importance. And as they come in and as a person develops a process for making the unconscious conscious, and as they have a wider network of things that they have made conscious, that becomes their mind and becomes their life. And as that as they begin to process the data of that decision making in relation to their relation between themselves and their inner life and all those things I listed with the external life and the feedback we're getting, at some point, which I don't think has a hard metric on it, I think there's sort of a tipping point that happens between the person and the reality itself, where then they say, oh, I'm comfortable that, you know, I am more conscious than unconscious, and now I understand that my decisions and my momentum of my decisions are in fact affecting to some degree the course of my life. Then at that point, I believe free will can start to come into play. When the person has developed a relationship with with themselves and then with the reality to a level where they can no longer be unaware of some of the major direct relationships that have been developed, both with themselves and with the reality, but it has to be both. And at that point, and that amount of time can be any amount of time. It's whatever amount of time is sufficient to create that understanding and that reality. Then that is when a person who has become self-aware enough and aware enough of their reality, then they can activate the free will in a knowing way. I suppose people could say, well, you can rush through knowing that you have an effect and activate it, but I don't think that's true. I just think people tend to think of like, well, they want positive outcomes, but that's not always the case. Excuse me. In fact, many people, like it's common for criminals to bypass any sort of real good setting up of value systems or whatever internally. Like their internal search can be very simplified and very based on setting up, being comfortable with immoral choices and setting up bad ethics almost without knowing it. And they can restrict their field of consciousness to a very narrow stream of outcomes that they're trying to get. And they can jump right into activating a form of free will that's based on a very narrow spectrum of self-centered illegal activity or immoral activity or both. And they found, and that's oftentimes when you see criminals or outlaws, there's a large subset of them that's what they found in that lifestyle. They found the freedom of self, and they found free will, and that's a common story for outlaws and criminals and whatnot. They're just like, okay, yeah, we know it's not right by regular society standards, but we reject those because I have found so much power in myself and the power to do my own will, and they call that free will, and they revel in it, despite the fact that it's producing disharmonious effects. Now, to go back to the more traditional side of things, where you assume that the practitioner is attempting to seek some sort of harmony with the universe and a greater unfolding of the knowledge and a greater relationship with the reality in general, which includes all things. When we get to that point and the person is attempting to activate their free will, or more, let's say, coming into awareness, we could even say that the initial inertia of the human life that's set up with so much unconscious activity occurring while the person learns how to make it more conscious, we can say those are like the training wheels that we get set up with of the free will. Because until you're conscious, because free will, the term itself implies that there is somebody willing it. And when you unpack the idea of somebody willing something, then that person who's willing the thing necessarily has to be in awareness of and capable of doing the willing. And a lot of times in philosophy, people who are attempting to analyze free will have not yet even activated their own free will. and they're complaining about determinism and that everything's fated, when in fact they haven't activated their free will yet, because the willing needs to be done by somebody at a level who has intention, awareness, a process for making the unconscious conscious, and for being able to objectively analyze the results of inner works and decisions and external reactions. So being at that level, when a practitioner is able to have established those things, the inner life, the correlation between internal decisions and external reactions and consequences, and they've done it over enough time to see which parts they're affecting, and then how that attracts from the reality itself more agency and more ability and more information to create a momentum of that person's decision-making stream, which is what I think most people are referring to when they really say free will. They say, can I have a momentum of my own personal decision-making to have some say over the course of my life? And I think when you get to that realm and you start to do it, the answer is yes. You do have free will. Now, does free will mean you get everything turns out your way? No. Because if we look at sort of the petri dish that we're in, this living experiment we call life, we are in here with infinite other things running their decision-making processes and their wills. Not to mention the fact that we're hard focused by being in the reality itself. So those other things that are in here that are also in the process of finding their will or ascending to free will, they're also affecting us. But their affecting us does not negate our free will. It simply affects our existence and needs to be taken into account when we're making our decisions and living our life, because we are all connected. It's all interconnected. And on top of it, it's like if you watched a bobsled run and then you put the same question to them, you go, well, the bobsled runs it's in its chute, right? It's in its track. And like, in this metaphor, our life is a track. And then you go, well, does the bobsled driver, does he have free will because he can only go left or right and his only decisions are to keep it on the track? Like, does he have free will because the bobsled, like once you go down the bobsled run, he can't have a steak dinner? Oh, well, he doesn't have free will because when he's on the bobsled run, he can't have a steak dinner. Just because life itself has some hard limits because it's sort of a track of its own, even though it's a very wide track, simply because you have a finite amount of choices doesn't negate free will. Because in reality, each person has more choices than they're capable of making. And once you exceed more than you can possibly do, it's practically infinity in terms of your choices. There's no difference between it like having to exceed your mental idea of innumerable decision makings or just having more than are practically usable for you. Like if you woke up this morning for breakfast and your menu had 10 million choices on it, technically that wouldn't be anywhere close to infinity. But practically speaking, if you had 10 million choices on your menu, it would be an infinite amount of choices in terms of its practicability determining your free will. Because if free will is this idea that you have to be able to will anything at any point, at any moment, with no context, that's not free will. That's just saying, like, I want to be a magician, or I want to play God or something. And that's an entirely different question. The real question is, given the constraints of human life, do you have faculty and agency within the spectrum of decision making that's available to a human organism to make those things in a vacuum? And the answer is clearly yes. Aside from other forces oppressing you or doing this or doing that, and assuming that you've done the work to boot up the human body to the point that it's capable of receiving free will, which I think is a point that really gets ignored in most of these analyses, is that it's a thing you have to work up to. It's like asking, oh, can a 10-year-old drive a car? Like, can humans really drive cars? And you pull out a 10-year-old and you go, see, this 10-year-old, he can't drive a car. And you go, yeah, well, he's 10 years old. Of course he can't drive a car. And then it's like, oh, well, can we have free will when people who like never tried to prepare themselves for the responsibilities of activating free will aren't doing it right? And you're like, well, it's not really a good example now, is it? But for those people who are capable and have exercised and practiced the ability to exercise their free will, the reports are pretty solid that the answer is yes. You know, those are the answers that come from people who summit Mount Everest and go in the Olympics and make scientific discoveries and things way less grand, people who live happy lives with lots of grandchildren and do things they love and start quilting bees, and it's all over the place. And a common thing as well, if other events come in and sideswipe you, is that an invalidation of your free will? No, just you build a ship and go on the ocean. Just because a big wave hits you doesn't mean you're not a sailor. It's just the universe is a big place, and just because everything doesn't go exactly the way that you will it to doesn't mean that you don't have free will. It just means you're in an environment with a lot of other factors, and it doesn't disparage your ability to make decisions for yourself once you've learned how to think for yourself and make decisions for yourself and enforce your will and allow your will to flow through. Obviously, and this is a topic of discussion that almost always ends up at the doorstep of theology or cosmology, because inherently everybody knows that humans were created, everything was created by God at some point. And when you get to this point, you start having to go to the creator to ask questions about the operator's manual, and you start going, hey, God, why, if you made me, why do all these things happen that are out of my control? Like, don't I have free will? And free will and absolute control are two entirely different things. Like, free will is you can go to Disneyland and you can go on all the rides that you want and the amount of time the park's open and whichever lines you want to walk in based on your taste, right? You have free will. You go in, you go on the rides, have a good time. Absolute control is you walk in and you get to tell like every other person in line where to stand and how to dress, and you get to tell everybody in the concession stands, like what to cook and how to price it. And and I do think that when it comes to free will, some people, they think that absolute control over a situation is the metric for it, and I believe it's way more akin to being able to just set yourself up, make your decisions, get connected to the reality, and initiate a flow based on the momentum of your decisions and emotions, your thoughts and feelings, with intention that is at the core of it one that you generate, and one that you know that you generate, and one that continues to go. And of course, it is subject to all the external factors in reality, and those can be deemed fair or unfair or whatever, but it's sort of irrelevant to just the core discussion of the tenet of free will, which I think is clearly evident that people have it, especially when you activate it. And honestly, I think even if you don't want to bring God into the discussion, where he's fueling it, and it seems to be the intention of the experience to give us a chance to have a taste of what it's like to have some free will and to have some creative powers. I think it's all evident without that. I think it's evident that if you're in reality and you have a process for creating events in your life, that you know that you're doing it and you're the only, you in this case, this is a case where only you are the judge, only you are the determiner, if that's even a word, of your decision making resulting in events in your life, and your will fueling that. And every single person that I know who's engaged in that process for long enough has come back and said, yes, there's a high enough correlation between my internal process and the external process, that even if it's not turning out exactly the way I want or I like or I hope, it is turning out in the way where it's obvious that my life is a result of me. And to me, that's the proof of free will. Your own life is the proof of free will. When you become aware of it and you've accepted it and you become consciously willing it. Doesn't mean it always turns out exactly the way you want. Most of the time it doesn't. But that's because we're living with all kinds of other people and all kinds of other factors. So yeah, free will. Get some. Well, thanks for spending some time down here at Philosopher's Corner. I hope you found this helpful, and have fun.